So I'm kind of sick of doing the whole three topics thing. That's a lot of topics, and I'm old and tired, and I just worked 37 hours today. So we're just going to talk about one thing, and then we're going to get to it. And honestly, you know what's been really, really grinding my gears lately? Mainstream media and its sort of little brother, fake independent media, right? That's actually mainstream media. Um, Anytime I have to sit through one of these stupid narratives they push, I feel like I'm going to lose my mind. Like I have this coworker, right, who was screaming earlier today about encroaching Trump fascism and how they fired thousands of suicide hotline workers from the VA. What are we going to do, Noah? And so I looked it up, right? Because that sounded crazy to me. Like if there's one thing I don't think Trump is going to one like sort of profession I don't think Trump is going to touch like that, it's VA suicide hotline workers. But whatever. So I look it up, right? And the only actual verifiable information that I could find was about one dude getting fired in that department, and it was for cause, which is not exactly, encroaching fascism just yet. It's kind of like, I don't know. I feel like it's like having like a friend, right? Who always tells stories in a way that makes him look like a big hero, you know? Like even though you were there and you know that they tripped over their own shoelaces and spilled nachos on the dog or whatever, which is not heroic, by the way. Mainstream media spin is like that, but sort of on steroids, right? Everything takes that one little grain of truth, that one tiny grain of truth, and makes a whole big novel out of that. And these days, it does it using social media and fake independent media. Mostly, I think, because the deep state is torturing me specifically me. And the part that really grinds my gears is that they present sort of two different versions of reality, right? Based on which fake ass side that you subscribe to. Like one outlet will be like, local hero saves cat from tree, right? And then the opposing side will be like, unhinged man / alleged terrorist climbs tree, terrifies cat, public outcry follows, right? It's the same story, but one makes you want to buy that guy a beer, and the other one makes you want to hide in your basement because there's probably IEDs in the area right now. That's how it works these days, though. Propaganda is all about framing, and social media is like the big box store, right? That you go to to buy all your frames. They've got more frames than you could ever shake a bunch of sticks at. They got rose-colored frames. They got doomer black pill frames. They got red pill frames, blue pill frames, frames that make you feel guilty for even looking at them and, tell you to check your privilege. Those are called woke frames, by the way. I'm stupid. Anyway, here's how it works, right? The media takes a story, strips it down to its bare bones, and then dresses it up in whatever outfit drives the political opinions of people the way they want them to go. You add social media gaming into the mix, bot farms, fake accounts galore, and then the hyper alienated PMC and reproletarianizing middle classers who are so desperate for some kind of acceptance and humanity because of the hyper alienation in our society right now. As they go through this process, they'll just glom onto anything that gives them a surge of superiority complex, right? And so you have an effect that becomes its own cause going forward from there as they carry the narratives forward, right? Just like the superstructure reinforcing the base after the base creates the superstructure. I know you thought maybe you would get away with this rant, not, mentioning dialectical materialism to you, but you were wrong. Wrong, sorry. Anyway, from there, you have to take into account the fake sides, right? You got one side saying, this policy is going to save the world, and the other side saying this policy is going to turn us into a dystopian hellscape and fascism. And the truth kind of gets lost somewhere along the way, right? The actual policies that are introduced are usually decided in a corporate boardroom or some, crazy Bilderberg retreat or whatever. And the media is there to get us to think what we're told to think about them. I mean, there was even a study proving just that a year or two ago out of Princeton, of all places, right? Empirical evidence that there's no such thing as democracy in America, which we'll get to in a bit. And this part is really sad, right? Because people buy it, especially middle classers, but lots of others too. They just don't have time to think more deeply about information coming to them. They never develop skepticism for what they're told. But as our ruling class drives the living conditions further and further into the fucking gutter, right? The real world just doesn't match up with the image that they get painted for them by media and social media, you know? It's like I had this one customer once, right? A couple of years ago, who hired me to put a bunch of cabinets in, right? And before I got there, he had tried to do it himself. And you know, he had like a picture in his head of how it was supposed to look. And when the instructions didn't make sense to him, or you know, the YouTube tutorial that he was watching didn't explain enough or whatever, he just started hammering stuff together until it kind of resembled the picture on the box a little, right? That's what people do with information. They've got this picture in their head of how the world works. And when the facts don't fit, they just kind of hammer them into place until they do. That's how you get insane anti-communists on social media, right? Just making up the dumbest stuff in order to keep the preconceptions they have about the world intact. You get them because brain hammers. Sorry, I wanted to say that again. Brain hammers is a good word though. It's kind of a good name for a band, you know, like Noah and the Brain Hammers. I'm stupid. I don't know. So what's the solution anyway? I honestly don't know, man. I don't know. Beyond developing some genuinely trustworthy places of information and or, you know, learning dialectical logic, Marxism, Leninism, maybe just take everything with a grain of salt or a whole salt shaker, I guess, at this point. And don't just mindlessly believe everything you read on the internet because it makes you feel better than someone. That's the easiest way to get manipulated. Don't even mindlessly believe me. Check what I say, right? Educate yourself and start the fucking song.
High Sheriff Hazard is a hard man to be. High Sheriff is his only plan. He digs through pockets, takes what he can, for he's High Sheriff Hazard. He caught me one evening, and here's what he said: "You look like a Russian, you look like a red, and if you're fond of your skin and your head, beware the High Sheriff of Hazard."
What's up, everybody? Good evening, and welcome to Noah's show. My name's Sebastian. That guy to my right is Noah, and with us today is a special guest, our friend, a good friend of the Institute, and a man I just had the pleasure of meeting a few minutes ago. It took way too long. Alex McKay of the Marx Engels Lenin Institute. Welcome to the show, brother. It's great to have you here.
Well, good to be here, comrades, and thank you for the invitation. I should reassure your audience, this is not an attempt to reverse 1776. I come in peace.
Well, that's good. We would not want to be a British colony again. That seems awful with what you guys are dealing with right now, especially. So for anyone who's unaware of who Alex is, he runs possibly my favorite show on YouTube. They're chock full of all kinds of great stuff. He recently started an interesting series about debunking anti-communist myths, something that we do here from time to time with Mac from RTSG. So I figured that might be a good place to start. But before we sort of get into any of that or what we had planned for tonight, why don't you tell the audience, for anyone who doesn't know who you are, Alex, just a little bit about you and how you came to be where you are and who you are.
Well, I started the Institute a 18 months ago or so now, partially inspired actually by your work, comrades, which is that somebody needed to pick up the work of actually popularizing Marxism-Leninism as far as is possible in the online spaces. And also, but as to draw from your opening comment, Noah, to not just like repeat memes to each other, but to get people to actually read something. And to not just to build some sort of cult of online personality, which is relatively easy to do. I believe you can get USAID money for doing that, or you used to be able to. I think that's called the bread tube business model. But to actually get people to read and engage critically with the work and also with what I'm saying about it. Because I came, and this is confession time, as this is kind of the confession booth for Marxists. I came ultimately from the Trotskyite tradition in Britain originally, which is, if you want to cut me off, you might as well do it now before we go any further.
No, that was a joke. Sorry.
These Americans are all the same. They're very abrupt people. I then came out of that and joined, of all things, the Labour Party in the Corbyn period, which some of your viewers may be familiar with what a disaster that was. And after that, absolutely hit the buffers like an out-of-control express train. It caused me to have to fundamentally reevaluate every single thing that I'd actually been advocating for since my early 20s, which is, I'm so ancient now, that's 20 years ago. So like
going to the old man's club.
Yeah, we are all there, but then again, as long as with age comes wisdom, then I suppose that makes up for it. So I'd been involved in anarchism briefly, but that was a incredibly bad joke. Trotskyism is bigger in but only in the imperialist countries, of course. And the more developed Marxist non-tradition really in this country. So I joined up with that, but it sort of led me into like the Labour Party, into like this terrible reformist nightmare. And so you have to reevaluate everything when everything sort of gets blown up. And it caused me to finally turn to a book written by two American scholars, Roger Kieran and Thomas Kenny, which is, of course, Socialism Betrayed, the story of the collapse of the USSR. And after I read that, that was sort of opened a door into reading everything else I could get my hands on with regard to the actual real history of the Soviet Union and developing a more Marxist-Leninist point of view. After that, I've joined the party of which I'm now proudly a member, which is Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. And we continue to try and rebuild the Marxist-Leninist tradition in this country, given that it was almost destroyed by the combined efforts of Khrushchevite revisionism and Trotskyism and reformism, strangely enough, all working together to make sure that Marxism and Leninism were either marginalized or destroyed. Just as it seems in the US, the Khrushchevite revisionists in the CPUSA, the Democratic Party, and the so-called Democratic Socialists all work together to try and basically make sure that no Marxist-Leninist party can come into existence. But given the rather dubious relationship of some of those organizations with the American state machine, perhaps that explains. So the point of of starting the institute was to get people like reading and engaging with the classic works, and to sort of play my part, however small, in rebuilding the idea, as explained by Antonio Gramsci, which is that we want to develop the organic intellectual of the working class again, which is that the root of any communist party has to be the ordinary worker who studies Marxism-Leninism alongside, of course, either working or caring for a family or both in many cases, who is able to master it and is able to then go out and explain it in a way that the workers in his or her community can understand and relate to. That's what we lost after the 50s, really, in Britain, when it just became a pursuit for students and petty bourgeois intellectuals, and the worker militancy was sort of systematically killed off. And so this is what a communist party must be built on, a solid base of worker organic intellectuals, of worker militants who know enough to organize in their community, in their workplace, and who also know enough in terms of the party organization to be able to go toe-to-toe with their own leadership, if need be, to argue a point and win a point. I've been a member of organizations where you had unquestioned totemic leaders who were never able to be taught, never able to be defeated. That was the Trotskyite movement. That's the Trotskyite movement. And that's because that's what Trotsky himself was. Talked about worker democracy, talk about Stalin being a betrayer. In reality, he was always a wannabe dictator who was prepared to sell himself to any, the lowest bidder quite a lot of the time. And all of his successor organizations, whether they are in the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, all the imperialist countries, operate in the same way. So the true Marxism-Leninism, and I'm sure most of your audience understands, it means raising the cultural and educational level of the worker to the point where the worker can, first of all, be the core component of the Communist Party and really embody the future ruling class, because that's where we want to go. And that's the understanding of Marxism-Leninism that we need to take into every corner of our countries, and to knock out the way the anti-communist caricature, which the US ruling class, the British ruling class, and all of their assistants on the left have been helping to reinforce for over 70 years.
Well said, brother. I mean, it's eerie how similar the UK is to America. It really is. I mean, here we have sort of like a loose conglomeration of what we call the fake left. And maybe we've had a sort of more structured coalescence of this as a vague movement rather than concrete organizations because of, Operation Chaos, COINTELPRO, these kind of programs that were dedicated to kill communist organizing. But we end up with the same sort of forces regardless. I mean, the old party here that, it's basically liquidated and all but named now. The reason we were forced to sort of reconstitute on new grounds was because the leadership had become just like the Trotskyists you described, right? Unquestionable. And the reason they're unquestionable is because they won't teach the rank and file anything about actual Marxism. And so at the time that Carlos and Eddie began the Institute, and I came along maybe a little less than a year later, it was desperately needed in the US. And there were really two groups that had a real view of Marxism-Leninism, and we came at it from way different histories, different angles, but we both arrived at Marxism-Leninism, and it was us at Midwestern Marx and Infrared. And so naturally, this eventually leads to the formation of ACP, and coincides with, the old party falling apart and people leaving, getting kicked out, etc. And we were the people in the position to bring all these people together, right? And I've noticed since then that we're seeing a sort of coalition of all these sort of anti-communist but calling themselves communist forces, aligning with the most ludicrous things you could think of, like neo-Nazis, the ruling class, etc., all in order to fight against the rise of a Marxist-Leninist party in the American Communist Party. And I mean, I know you guys have gone through the same sort of problems in CPGBML. Maybe that's why I feel a close affinity for you guys. Because I mean, even just, questioning gender ideology, have that coalition, go after you just viciously, as viciously as, they've gone after us, obviously. I don't know that you're a little younger, Sebastian. So what I'd really like to do is hear your opinion on these two things kind of happening.
Oh, what specifically?
Like just the way it's sort of lining up to the same thing, even though the histories are a bit different.
Yeah, and I wanted to make the point, or tie in Alex's point to your initial rant, and it's the power of reading, educating oneself, and seeing through these distortions. And these ruling classes of similar, they had similar means of distorting Marxism to the general public, but in educating oneself, you can see through the distortions of media as something systemic, and rather than just being accidental mistakes. They get one story wrong here or there, but generally speaking, they're trying to tell you the truth. And I think that the tactics that they've used, the things that they funded, hopefully will be shattered by the CPGBML and the ACP.
Yeah. I look, there's only so long you can keep the lies going in the face of rapidly accelerating contradictions within society. There really is. But I want to look, I think the fact that the Marx Engels Lenin Institute became a thing is fantastic. There are way too few of us providing Marxist education, and way too many people just sort of repeating anarchist nonsense or sort of mechanist Trotskyite dogmas and calling it Marxism. And when you really get into sort of what the actual Marxist text say, it's impossible to really think about, like believe any of that stuff, right? But I want to get into some education tonight. I think we have a good sort of program lined up. Sebastian, we can let you go and start your thing, and we're going to get into it. What we're talking about tonight is sort of debunking the myth that bourgeois democracy is democratic, and explaining how actual existing communist democracy, proletarian democracy, whatever you want to call it, is the only way to actually sort of achieve a real democratic society. And we're going to get to it now. Also, don't forget, after we're done with all this, Alex has promised to stick around and take some calls with us and answer questions. So anything you got for Alex, by all means, call in and we will go over it. Anyway, let's just jump right into it, brother. Where do you want to start?
Well, we could jump off like what your last comment there, which is the convergence of left anti-communism and ultra-reactionaries, because there's several periods in recent history, well, the history of the last 100 years, where these groups have coincided together. You have, of course, the exposure of the Trotskyites and their collaboration with fascism in the 1930s, in the form of like Trotsky's collaboration with both German imperialism, Italian fascism, of course, he had a nice brief holiday in fascist Italy on his way out of the Soviet Union. Not a lot of at a time when the Italian Communist Party leadership were all in prison or exiled, and of course his collaboration with Ukrainian fascism, as expressed in several articles that he wrote towards the end of the 1930s, calling for the Soviet Union to be broken up. And then he sort of says, "Oh, but I want a socialist Ukraine to be independent." But of course, to believe that, you have to then completely isolate the demand from the actual concrete circumstances and sets of relations that existed at the time. So you've got that example of like left anti-communism collaborating with imperialism and fascism in the 1930s. And then you have the same thing from after the death of Stalin and the treachery of the Khrushchevite revisionists, which is that Trotskyism is revived because Khrushchev gave it life again. And then from that point onwards, you have the emergence of the Anglo-American human rights NGO complex, which maybe Comrade Trump will accidentally kill in his reforms. You have then that convergence with the Trotskyites, with the democratic socialists, so-called, of the DSA and the Labour Party in this country. And you have then Eastern European anti-communist exiles hopping on board with this as well. That then forms the basis of the support in the West for Gorbachev in the 1980s and the counter-revolution in the east of Europe and the USSR. So there's various points in history where there is a clear convergence between everybody from like Russian ultra-reactionary capitalist restorationists and Boris Yeltsin through to Trotskyite organizations giving Yeltsin left cover in their press and confusing the issue in the workers' movement. And I believe you had the same thing with certain elements in the CP-USA being pro-Gorbachev in the 1980s as well. So,
Yeah.
And what was the big argument that most of them used? It was that, oh, well, the Soviet Union isn't democratic. It isn't democratic enough. And unfortunately, this was feeding and was also fed by tendencies within the Soviet Party itself, which started to agree publicly with all of this and sign up to like what I would call NGO-inspired declarations, like the Helsinki Declaration and stuff like that, which was essentially bringing in the discourse of the human rights NGO world into the Soviet system, basically brought in by the counter-revolutionaries to dilute further Soviet democracy, which still existed in certain ways even after years of Khrushchevite revisionism. And that's why, of course, Gorbachev had to kill the role of the party and kill the Soviet system completely. And Yeltsin had to literally blow it up in the early 1990s because working class power in the USSR, though under attack, remained in place in partial form all the way up to about 88, 89, when Gorbachev finally kills off the leading role of the party. And who's backing all of that up? Well, it's the left anti-communists cheering on each stage of the dissolution of Soviet power. And the central part of this comes back to the democratic question again, which is how anybody who, well, you get all these people uncritically using the word democracy without attaching the class descriptor to it. So, like, you cannot compare, like, Soviet Union, even as late as, I would say, 83, 84, had problems. Needed to address those problems. Still more democratic than Britain or the US at the time. Much more. Otherwise, the counter-revolution wouldn't have been necessary. Because the counter-revolution was about pushing the working class out of power and bringing forth the sort of shadow bourgeoisie out of the shadows and into power, all dressed up in this human rights, democracy language. And of course, even the shreds of proletarian democracy, which survived years of revisionism, were still better than what you get in the bourgeois democracies of the West, which is where the worker gets to put a cross in a box every 2, 3, 4 years for some bourgeois fool who's usually got a load of blackmail material on him in the basement of MI6 or MI5 or the FBI. And he just does whatever the hell the ruling class tells them anyway. And then they say it's democracy because there's, in our case, 5, 6, 7, 8 parties that you can vote for, all of which, just to give you an example from this weekend, all of which issued the same statement as Keir Starmer saying, continue the war in Ukraine. Yep. So isn't that funny? Isn't that funny that, like, you get supposed Scottish nationalists, supposed Welsh nationalists, supposed Irish nationalists as well, and various like Nigel Farage, libertarians, various other characters in one form or another, all saying continue the war with Ukraine. It's almost like the ruling class cracked a whip, and all of these supposedly different parties all stood to attention and says, yes, sir. Right down to, of course, our fake trade union federation, the TUC, Trade Union Congress, who had a rally declaring themselves in solidarity with Ukraine in London over the weekend. Not solidarity with, yeah, go ahead, mate.
No, I just want to, there's a few things already because I don't want to get too far ahead. But there's something very similar happened here where like what we call business unions, right? Basically, a labor or the remnants of a labor aristocracy in America, right? We're literally holding protests against the dissolution of USAID. And the old party was acting like this was this like noble defensive democracy against a coup, which brings me to my actual point is a game I call definition mongering they do, right? They sort of flip the place of material reality and a word. So they predefine the word democracy. Democracy means this and this and this particular thing. And then they create forces that fulfill these, but end up abandoning the actual essence of what we intuitively grasp as democracy, meaning, the root of the word is from the Greek, right? Demos and kratos, power of the propertyless people, right? So it sort of abandons this as it fulfills these particular characteristics that they say make something democracy. And this is how bourgeois ideology works just in general, right? Is it measures what something is based on characteristics that it looks at. And this is a problem with the Trotskyites as well, their lack of Marxism and understanding how a thing develops being its real essence. It's instead a counting of characteristics. You know how many Trots have told me in the past that, Russia is imperialist because of this characteristic or that characteristic, or China is imperialist because of this or that. And it's based off of Lenin's list. But what they don't understand is Lenin's list was in a particular context, right? He's describing things happening as they're arising. The characteristics something takes on are always historically determined. And the Marxist way of viewing it is finding out how those develop and understanding that development as our premise, right? What's the sort of unity and diversity of cause and effect and interpenetration of different aspects creating that. I know that got kind of like in the weeds, but it also brings me to how they were acting with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right? And how similar it is to nowadays with the alignment of all of these forces against the like actual materially progressive forces of the world. You had Trotskyites, you had anarchists, you had neo-Nazis, you had everything under the sun that was materially in support of imperialism as the Soviet Union fell. As decaying as it had become, it was still the sort of beacon of hope for the world at the time, right? And I mean that happening was devastating for the world, and these people were cheering it on. And now we have this same sort of alignment of forces, and I find that interesting. There's one other thing I wanted to talk about that I find fascinating. I was talking to Carlos earlier today, and we were discussing this new book he's reading on the collapse of the Soviet Union from a new angle. I mean, Kieran and Kenny's book is obviously the go-to, right? But he's reading this one called Collapse that looks at Gorbachev and the Gorbachev question differently. And I wonder what your opinion is on this, because from what I know, you basically hold the same exact view I do. But this book sees things differently. Instead of showing Gorbachev as this sort of right opportunist and liberal, right, it shows him almost as an ultra left with like the same sort of dogmas as Trotsky against sort of the stagnation of bureaucracy, right, that he claimed that Stalin had implemented, right? And it was this very dogmatic, anti-dialectical reading of Lenin that this guy says Gorbachev had. And this leads to things like perestroika, right? It was supposed to be an attack on bureaucracy, but at a time when an attack on that bureaucracy spelled the dissolution of the entire project. I don't know, like it's called Collapse, by the way. Supposedly it's pretty good, but what do you think about that sort of view that he was more sort of ultra left and Trotskyite than right opportunist?
Well, I will return to my favorite Stalin quotation, which is that the ultra leftist deviation is in reality a rightist one. Because the two have always gone together. If we think about this, like who were the natural partners of the Trotskyites in the 30s? It was the Bukharinists.
Yeah,
it was those who called for the disillusion of the planned economy completely, essentially the surrender of the abolition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Trotskyism, the Trotskyites, and the Bukharinites agreed on all of that. So let's fast forward into and look at a guy called Alexander Yakovlev, who was Gorbachev's chief propagandist. He started out, well, he was various different things, including, according to some Russian sources, a potential asset of the Central Intelligence Agency, due to a suspicious amount of time he spent in the US in the later 1950s, I believe, and some time as ambassador to Canada in the early 1970s. He was an ultra-left in the late 60s, and he approached like the nationality question on an ultra-leftist basis. Basically would have blown up the national question in the constituent republics of the USSR if he'd have proceeded on the basis that he did. And so I can see where the author is coming from in terms of that, but there's also an argument to say that Khrushchev himself was a Trotskyite because he was adopting many of the same positions. And this is the dialectical relationship between the ultra left and the ultra right, which is, and again, this is, Lenin pointed this out, Stalin explored it thoroughly, which is that the objective results of the ultra-left turn are ultra-right. So let's just use as our example, our test case, Russian special military operation, of which we are now we're into the third anniversary of this now. The anarchists, the Trotskyites, the uncertain people calling themselves Marxist-Leninists, who in reality are not, all said Russia is an imperialist power. They all said, they said it's an inter-imperialist war. They offered very little or very poor evidence of this, often a misreading of Lenin's work on imperialism, as you say. So what's the objective result of taking that position, which Trotskyites never want to look at? It is the reinforcement of the much more powerful narrative of the ruling class, which has behind it all of the power of US imperialism and British imperialism and French imperialism and the entire NATO bloc. So what are you doing as a leftist then, if you are then reinforcing that and giving it left cover? You're aiding, really, the propaganda of the ruling class. So your ultra-leftist turn is in reality confusing the issue in the eyes of the advanced workers who these groups might have the opportunity to engage with, and doing the work of the ruling class on providing left cover to this, just as they did in the later period of the Soviet Union when they were saying that Gorbachev's attacks on bureaucracy were paving the way for real socialism. He wasn't attacking the bureaucracy, of course, not really. He was attacking the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the base of which was still solidly working class. And the hierarchy of it had some rotten elements to it, which should have been driven out. That's true. But let's just look at if Gorbachev was attacking the bureaucracy, if Yeltsin was an anti-bureaucrat, why did the bureaucracy in post-communist Yeltsinite Russia in the 90s get bigger than it had been in the RSFSR in the late 1980s? Why, if we're going to get into that, is it still bigger today? So capitalism is actually very bureaucratic.
It's interesting. this happens in different forms all through political history, because what it really always boils down to is it's just the class struggle. And I mean, Marx and Engels put it perfectly in their first big publication when they said that more and more the world's separating itself into the two great camps, right? The camp of the bourgeoisie and the camp of the proletariat. When the Trots say neither Moscow nor Washington, what they're really saying is, by default, I'm on the side of Washington. Because that's what they end up aiding, the way they look at themselves. And another thing Marx said, that we don't judge a man by his opinion of himself. The way they look at themselves is immaterial entirely. What they think they see themselves doing is immaterial entirely. What matters is the real concrete outcomes of their actions. And like you're saying with Gorbachev, the concrete outcome was the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Yeltsin coup, tanks in Moscow, right? I mean, there's no other way to look at it. It's in what I really find interest, and I keep saying finding things interesting, but I just always find it fascinating how we see this happening over and over and over again, and people seem to not learn their lessons, right? They can't seem to grasp the way this is playing out again in history, because they end up, neither Beijing nor Washington right now. Inter-imperialist rivalry, etc. And I mean, we could get into why that is if you want, but it's just something I think about constantly. I don't know.
Well, the issue with the Trotskyites, and this is, I speak with knowledge of having been one, is that they don't read. Not really. They don't read. They don't really read the history. They don't really read the. They certainly don't read Marx and Engels. Not really. I mean, the best you'll get is a casual read through of the Communist Manifesto. They're not going to read like Anti-Düring. They're not going to read like any of the great works that actually outline what scientific socialism actually is. Because if you're conducting scientific socialist analysis, then you must come to an analysis of your conclusions from previous tests. So what is the analysis of the collapse of the Soviet Union, i.e. what is the analysis of the Trotskyites as to the role that they play within it? They don't have one. They don't have one, because they would then have to come face to face with the fact that they spent decades backing up a ruling class agenda that has, in the words of Stalin, made sure that the working class of the entire world got seized by the throat for a generation. Stalin, of course, was talking about if the Soviet Union was to collapse back in the 30s. And none of them have faced this. None of them have ever had a reckoning with any of the mistakes that they've made, because their job is to mislead people. If we're getting into the reality of this, the anti-communist left's job is to basically not educate people, but to recruit a bunch of enthusiastic, usually students, keep them running around in frenetic activity for a few months or a few years, and ultimately then lead them back to one of two things: voting for the Democrats if you're in the United States, or voting for the Labour Party if you're in Britain. That's what organized Trotskyism and some anarchists end up doing. And the reason for this is because, of course, this is their job. This is their job. Ultra left for 3 years out of 4. Vote for the Democrats to stop fascism in the next year, then back to ultra leftism for another 3 years. So this is where it leads you
until you get burned out and quit.
That's and then you recruit another bunch of students to mislead for a few years. Then they all drop out and burn out and to become deeply cynical. It's almost as if this is what these organizations are actually designed to do, and do it very effectively.
Yeah, I've seen on this subject, we've gone into quite a bit of how the fake left was sort of created in America. I'm sure there's similar programs over there, but one thing that strikes me is sort of Oh God, I'm losing my train of thought as I speak. Give me 1 second here. I'm sorry, Alex. It seems to me that as they sort of redirect potential revolutionary energy away from anything that could ever genuinely be a threat to the ruling class.
Mhm.
There has to be some sort of way to keep them in line, right?
Mhm.
Because as you're sort of spinning your wheels, and I mean it's been decades now where they've called themselves revolutionaries and changed literally nothing. It's continued
Mm.
getting worse, right? But as these young people continue spinning their wheels, they need something to keep them in line, to keep them coming back, or to keep them from wanting more. Not saying that this is everybody, but a lot of people do, and you would be surprised how many members of the American Communist Party got sort of jaded with the lack of anyone being able to do anything in these organizations and joined us because they saw us working,
Mm.
right? So to me, it seems like wokeism and sort of cancel culture are the perfect tools to do this with, right? Because the minute you begin talking about, well, what if we went and organized the entire working class? Imagine something as crazy as that, right?
Mm.
Imagine working class people across racial lines, men and women, all getting together and fighting our real enemy. They attack those people like, well, you're not centering, disabled, POC, trans, whatever's, right? You're not centering this and that. You have to be intersectional, man. That kind
Mhm.
of thing. And honestly, because of the like viciousness of the people doing this, it scares people into acquiescing and giving up.
Mhm.
I didn't even touch the question of sort of queer theory, gender ideology, etc. for a while because of that, because they attacked my family, right? And
Mm.
I'm like, look, I need my family to stay out of this, and there's no low they won't go to. I don't know what's your take on that sort of thing and the way they keep people sort of in line.
Well, I think there's as you correctly intimate in your contribution there, there's two things to consider here. There's the people who join Trotskyite organizations thinking they're joining some sort of revolutionary tradition because they don't see anything else going on. They don't see nothing else is presented to them as revolution or Marxism. So this is why I signed up. It's why loads of people do. Then there's the leaders at the top who largely know exactly what they're doing and what their role is. There's a reason why you get Trotskyite leaders who lead like minuscule sects living off the money that they make from that for 5 decades. I'm pretty sure they're not living off the subs of the members. So where's the rest of the money coming from? Open question. Answer us maybe on the messages in the chat if you have answers to that. Also in the FBI right now and have access to those records. I'm sure there's a secure email address somewhere that the ACP has that you can send those files to, perhaps, just making a suggestion. But moving on to the other point, which is the usage of these organizations to sort of send people down blind alleys, demoralize them, etc. Everything all of these fake organizations require a new sort of regeneration of fake struggle to engage in. Anything to stop the working class organization and working class consciousness being raised. So what do you have in previous generations? You have these organizations doing stuff like attaching themselves to 20 years ago. It was the 25 years ago. It was the anti-capitalist movement, the whole Seattle thing, etc. What do these organizations do with that? Steered it in the direction of dead-end social democracy or dead-end anarchism, where there was, if I'm remembering Seattle 99 correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, there was opportunities to build alliances between radical left activists and working class Americans affected by deindustrialization and the asset stripping and hollowing out of the United States. What did the left do? Run down a completely different direction. Anti-war movement in both the US and Britain, same thing, lead it down the path of like milk and water pacifism. move into
same thing with Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah, Occupy Wall Street, which is of course Occupy in America was a much bigger thing than it was over here. But what does that get led down into? Like useless virtue signaling hippieism, which essentially has no appeal to the American worker whatsoever, despite the fact that the American working class is under siege and things are getting progressively worse or regressively worse. There is a crying need for a unified working class response to the siege that they are under. And what happens? Gets diverted again. Fast forward a few years, you get the rise of Trump. You get like elements of the American working class going after turning to like what you might call right populism of Trump. What does the left go after? It goes in the direction of identity politics. It has no response. The only thing it can do is like more distractions and more diversions, etc., etc. And this is exactly the only conclusion that you can reach is that this is what it's meant to do, because they can't be that bad. They can't be that consistently wrong. But either they have a wholly opportunistic praxis, which they do, but how can you go for 30, 40, 50 years getting it wrong, leading people down a blind alley and not realizing you're getting it wrong? Well, you're probably paid to get it wrong, is the only conclusion that one can draw in the end.
Well, I mean, look, and it's not even just the decades that they have. They also have so many people. They also have millions upon millions upon millions of dollars. I mean, look at places like Left Forum, funded by giant financial institutions with millions of dollars in donations. I find it peculiar and maybe a little beyond coincidence that they have all of this funding and they've changed nothing. Not even just like little things here and there. They've changed nothing. After George Floyd got murdered by the state here in America, we had the largest protest demonstration in the entire country's history. And nothing happened afterwards. Why? Right? We had Black Lives Matter, which begins as a slogan, right? And then what happens? NGOs creep in, the Democratic Party creeps in. They create Black Lives Matter Incorporated, BlackLivesMatter.com, and these NGOs and professional activists take it from the original protesters. Anything grassroots is removed from it, and it's steered in a direction that neuters it, basically, that makes it impotent, weak, and ineffective at actual change. They really wanted to redo policing in this country entirely. There were concrete demands originally. As that happens, those concrete demands disappear, and it's just about, identity politics, right? Granted, a more coherent identity politics than we have nowadays, but still something that ends up being used as a media cudgel to divide the working class, right? They, just like I was talking about in the opening, they give one version where there's these, like violent rioters and they're destroying everything. And then the other one, there's these heroic heroes and they're saving the day. But really what happened is the Democrats came in and made sure it was a nothing burger. And so when you combine the money with the no results, with the decades and decades, I mean, we're talking about basically since after Gus Hall died. He was like the last vestige of somebody who cared with power in these organizations. So since he died, that's all it's been. And then the American Communist Party comes about, and suddenly all of these groups that all hated each other are now aligned against it. I find that strange, and I find it strange that, with no money, we've already begun doing things that they couldn't do over decades. And I find it strange that with all that money, with all those people, they couldn't do these things because they seem like common sense to us, right?
Yeah.
Put down roots in your community, actually build real connections, etc. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling now, so feel free to step in.
Well, I mean, shouldn't be. I think it shouldn't be that much of a surprise that they would unify against the ACP, because if the ACP succeeds in what your fundamental aims are, even just to the point where you're building, as I said earlier, the rebuilding the organic intellectuals of the American working class across the United States, then that's big game up for the PSL, for the DSA, for all of these, let's just say, anti-communist leftist organizations. Game over, because suddenly the genuine people who might have joined them 20, 30 years ago, that recruit stream will get choked off, because though the people who are genuine and want to see something happen would go and join the ACP. So that's their recruitment killed off, which means their organizations will cease to be renewed, which means that when their current leadership retires or passes away, that means that organization is dead. And this is why they're getting so mad under I think it's the current leader of the anti-ACP coalition is a gentleman called Daniel Tutt, who me and a fellow comrade have done some streams on that guy's rambling, incoherent nonsense before. But it's not a surprise, because like, you present these people with something that's real, or even something which aims to be real, and suddenly it blows up all of their fake little games that they've been playing for years. I remember seeing one criticism of the ACP from, I forget who it was. It was either Tut or someone who was close to him, who said, you're ruining our little leftist online community. It's like, well, good. Because
absolutely. Right, that's what we want to do.
Yeah, because it's like, if Marxism is a social club for people with severe social dysfunction who don't want to actually go out there and meet the American masses where they are, but prefer to construct perfect little theories about why we could succeed if it wasn't for those dastardly Stalinists, if it wasn't for the fascist Republicans, if Obama had courage, or whatever, right. Jacobin magazine's running with
blame
this month.
Everything on everyone else.
Yeah, or whatever Sam Cedar's latest painfully stilted scripted rant is, then it's, or get the money out of politics, or whatever it is that the latest thing is. Then if that all gets revealed for the farce that it is, then people will move on and stop paying attention to these clowns. Who, when it's revealed that they don't want anything other than to be the official useless opposition to the American ruling class, who obtain for themselves the position of I think it's Lenin's old phrase, the permanently outvoted minority. And you can be.
Sorry to interrupt. I just real quick, and that's a perfect way to put it, right? I think it's fun. They'll cease to be the subculture that they've worked so hard on developing, right? And I think that's why they're scared now, is because we want to destroy this subculture. We want communism to be for everyone, and they need it to be this sort of, like pansy little discourse in academic salons and journals that only they can understand. And we're saying, no, it's everybody's. You don't get it. You don't get to take this and hide it away from people and lie to people about it. None of that. We're going to take it, and there's nothing you can do about it. I don't know. That's just how I see it.
Well, there's if it's a subculture, then it's failed. That's the point. You might be a small organization. I make no bones about it. Like at the moment, we are a growing organization, but we're still a relatively small organization. But we aim to orient ourselves to the point where we go to the masses and start engaging with them as to where they are and how they are at the moment. Not in the sense of tailism, but in the sense of learning where the masses are and learning how to get the masses, or to identify the advanced workers and to start educating them in Marxism-Leninism. This is a stage-by-stage process. And if your aim is to be a subculture, then it's not political. Then you're engaging in essentially a social club. But that's the way that the left has been for a long time. It's what the new left fundamentally always was, which is that those who sit within it can get rewarded by creating a subculture and then being like always on the losing side. Oh, we lost another struggle. Never mind. Isn't that sad? We'll have a memorial next year. And that's
Have a meeting about it.
we'll have a meeting about it purely online because these people don't like to deal with with anybody else in person. Right. If they do, they end up with like that DSA conference where everybody's waving their hands in the air, and you got to make careful consideration for the poor comrades that are allergic to sound. The point being that like that's how it's presented to people, and a lot of people like they want the aesthetics of rebellion without anything associated with it, especially not the dangers. So like I had a really good education many years ago, which was I ran into a bunch of guys who were like electricians who'd been blacklisted by the employers, and also that their trade union had played a role in assisting the blacklisting. And the reason why the trade union had played a role in assisting the blacklisting was because it had a sweetheart deal with the employers. Basically, they get to say they represent this many workers as long as they shop and sell out the worker militants to the employers in the building trade, basically. And that saw hundreds of men blacklisted for decades, couldn't get work on any building site up and down the country. They end up working in unsafe jobs in isolated areas where the employers don't ask too many questions. And the conditions mirror that. And what I saw from those guys who'd stuck with it, who hadn't given up on their beliefs, whose families had suffered, who'd been denied work, who'd been in poverty, who'd really been through the mill because of their belief in just basic trade unionism, was that they had immeasurably more courage and understanding of the situation and the sacrifices that would be required than any number of like academics in any sort of Trotskyite or anarchist organization or reformist organization, because they'd been through it, they lived it. And the point is that sacrifice is a scary thing. It's not something that one seeks out and what one does not seek martyrdom if you are, in any way sane, but it's something that you must face if you have to accept the reality that you're going up against very powerful, very ruthless forces of the ruling class and the state machine who won't hesitate to ruin your life, your family's life, the life of an entire community. These are people who will annihilate an entire industry to remove worker militants, who will annihilate whole countries to boost profit margins of like multinational corporations. These people don't, if I can get crude for a moment, don't give a fuck how many people they kill or how many lives they ruin. Now, going up against them is a frightening prospect. Terrible. If you're taking it seriously, which is why if you're taking it seriously, then your only chance is to bring the masses with you, because they have the currently existing structures, power, weapons, centuries of legitimation of their usage of violence. We have the only possible thing that the communists have on our side is the mobilized masses that can overcome that entrenched power. And so if you're serious, then you have to go in the direction of mobilizing those masses. If you're not serious, then the state will give you a play area you can sit in and like literally throw shit at the wall,
100%, brother. I agree on absolutely everything you just said. It's really a good litmus test, right? To be an actual communist, like materially speaking, not just deciding to describe yourself with a word. You need to be genuinely willing to risk everything. You have to be aware that you are stating unequivocally that your enemy is the people in power, right? The people who own everything, who control the media, who control the military, etc. And that's a terrifying thing to be, right? People like you mentioned Daniel Tutt earlier, and you said something really that resonated a lot with me, is that they want the aesthetics of rebellion, right? Like someone like Tutt wants to think about rebellion, He doesn't want to actually be a rebel. And that's where comfy middle-class people like Tut have a difference between regular working-class people. Because regular working-class people don't rebel because we think it's cool or we like thinking about it or we dig an aesthetic. We do it because it's necessary. Because we get to a point where we can't continue on in the old way. Where in order to defend our families, it's time to fight. And that fight takes on many different forms, right? But it happens, right? It's what did Marx say, that it's now hidden, now open, right? That's how the class struggle works. And when it becomes open, people in the middle classes waver because they don't really need any change. They just like thinking about rebellion. And that's what Tut is for me, honestly. He likes, that's why when he spoke with Haas Aldine, the chairman of the party, he kept saying, well, you know what's worrying to me, Haas, is this and that and this and that. It made up some ludicrous story about his friend crying because someone did a meme on the internet, right? And it's like, that's not a fighter. That's not someone willing to risk everything. And to be a communist, you need to be willing to risk everything. That's what we do. They will come out. Like, look who our revolutionaries in America are famous for the state coming after them. They murdered Fred Hampton when he was 21 years old. They tried to get MLK to kill himself. They sent his wife tapes of him having sex with other women to ruin his life. They come after you in the sleaziest, most anti-humanity ways. And you got to be ready for that. Revolution is not a safe space. It's just not.
Well, yes, and the point to go back to is like what the ruling class has been very good at since probably the 60s is manufacturing the aesthetics of rebellion and selling it back to people. Like, so people literally grow up and think like rebellion means wearing this. Rebellion means like taking
wearing
this
a Che
drug or
Guevara
that drug.
t-shirt.
Yeah, wearing a Che t-shirt, having your hair cut in a certain way, wearing a certain thing. Whereas, or watching some TV show or another, which is put on by, of course, a giant corporation. These are all like elements of the aesthetics of rebellion. This is like what the ruling class is prepared to give to you. You can have a controlled, curated non-rebellion, which looks like one, inside some firm barriers that largely sticks to culture, essentially, completely divorced from material reality. So that's what they're happy with you doing. And the Daniel Tutts of the world, or if we go to the British case, the Navarro Medias of the world, the Owen Joneses of the world, all are very happy in that space. They can make money in that space. They can carve out a very respectable career later on as members of the Labour Party or the Democrats in that space, and they can talk about their radical past, which is never very radical. But to your point about like the why does the worker rebel? Well, the worker rebels because the worker has no choice, ultimately. To defend your class interests, once you understand what your class interests are, and you go from the point of being, as Marx says in The Poverty of Philosophy, you go from being like a part of a class which is merely class in itself, to being a class for itself. And you start to evolve to the point where, as a class, there is an understanding of the need to move beyond the trade union struggle into the struggle for power itself. That's all done because the worker's getting hammered and is drawing more and more radical conclusions as a result of the hammering the ruling class is giving to the working class. So that's the worker doesn't pick up a Che Guevara t-shirt because he likes the aesthetics or something like that. It's a necessity. It's why did the workers and peasants of 1917 Russia rebel? It's because it's a necessity. Why is the Chinese Communist Party able to carry on a war for a quarter of a century before attaining power? It's because it's a necessity for the peasants and the proletariats, because life is unbearable under imperialist or Japanese militarist domination. Why will the American working class ultimately rebel? Because the American ruling class and the American monopolies will ultimately make life more and more unbearable for the great bulk of the American workers. and that will be what pushes things forward, what part of what pushes things forward. And people in the middle class left don't want to believe that, because they want to believe that things can continue in the same old way, but it can't. The ruling class, as we're seeing with the Trump presidency, the ruling class is now at the point where some of them, at least, believe they can't continue in the same old way, which is the point. We're getting to that point too. And so now you have this emerging divergence within the ruling class. You have more of the American working class believing that they can't continue in the same old way. They haven't drawn revolutionary conclusions yet, but at least you and the comrades there are putting together an organization that they could potentially discover and aren't put off by it because it's fronted up by Daniel Tutt and his trio of, I don't know, his trans jazz band or whatever the hell it is that he does.
What Sebastian, our producer, just mentioned, Novara Media from over there just put out a post praising Die Linke from Germany as radical, which is funny. Like Vijay Prashad did that same thing today, saying to like uphold the traditions of Karl Liebknecht. Like these people are Zionists. Like amazing.
Hardcore Zionists.
The fake left immediately always aligns with itself like that. But go on. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, I was going to say, like, the Die Linke is a great example of, like, they're led by, like, a woman who, she loves heavy metal and she's got tattoos. Well, who gives a shit? Seriously, who gives a fucking shit? Like, I don't care whether somebody's got tattoos or not. Like, it makes absolutely no difference to me. I don't care what somebody wears. That makes absolutely no difference to me. These are all aesthetic things which, like, leftists love to fixate on. Now, if you're 15 years old and you get fixated on that, that's a thing. Okay, get over it eventually. But if you're 45 years old or 50 years old, mate, you should have left it behind a long time ago. Get over yourself. You look ridiculous. Calm down. And again, Die Linke is an extreme example of, like, something which is openly Zionist. But then, if let's go back in diving into the Trotskyites again, like, who will say we oppose Israel. Okay, good start. But then read the rest of the article, and what drops in right before the end, usually after they hope most people have stopped reading. They denounce all current resistance forces in occupied Palestine. Okay, so then who's going to fight Israel? Who's doing the fighting?
So basically, you don't oppose Israel; you're pro-Israel at that point.
Objectively speaking, if you don't oppose the force which is doing the genocide, if you don't support the force that's fighting them, then what do you support? Nothing. Which means you're, objectively speaking, if you're not getting in the way of U.S. imperialism and its Israeli colonial entity, then you're really, it's another example of them creating this perfect world which is in a bubble and has no relation to the existing set of forces whatsoever. Because, again,
it's just another neither Moscow nor Washington.
Yeah, neither Hamas nor Tel Aviv, but international Arab socialism, which doesn't exist at the moment. And, like,
and they don't have any plan on how to get there, or realistic roadmap, or any real association with actual resistance forces on the ground, etc.
No, I mean, you've got, like, what is it? A quarter of the population of Lebanon just turned up to the funeral of Hassan Nasrallah. Like, that's serious business. That's where, like, that's the masses of Lebanon turning out to the funeral of a resistance leader. Yeah, not somebody that we as Marxist-Leninists would, like, share all things in common with, but somebody who was leading a genuine national liberation movement in Lebanon, which is, of course, a national liberation movement that continues, and who can rally huge numbers of Lebanese workers to the cause, and therefore somebody who it's a man whose organization we should take seriously and engage with if we are to be serious in any way, and support them as far as they further the cause of the national liberation of the country and the defeat of Zionism and the defeat of British and US imperialism. It's like the inability of the ultra-leftists to understand that you can carry out an analysis which doesn't mean that you are suddenly on board with every single aspect of the Hezbollah program. We don't need to be. We're not Lebanese. It's not down to us how they choose to conduct their resistance.
100%.
nor do we have nor should we think that we have the right to say to anybody who's fighting imperialism how they conduct their resistance. Our job is to try and get in the way, however we can, of the imperialists in our of a ruling class in our own countries, and to seek to stop their war-making powers, however we can. And that's our job.
When it really comes down to it, we do it because our interests as working class people here align with theirs.
Mhm.
They experience only our ruling class. Like, think about how horrible that has to be for someone to your only connection with America or England or France or whatever is the ruling class, which is like the most rapacious, disgusting class in history, right? Especially right now. And it makes me think of the ultra lefts and all of these people and their purity fetish, really, right? Like, they condemn Hamas, they condemn Hezbollah, and all of these forces condemn Putin and the anti-fascist struggle in Ukraine right now. Everything's condemned in favor of like a mythical, pure world that just doesn't exist. They're like, well, if I were doing it, I would be good while doing it. It's like, well, that doesn't matter. You're not. They are. So maybe they know something you don't, right? Or maybe they have something you don't, besides, balls. But meaning a correct analysis that has led them to this struggle. If you're in some sort of left-wing organization and you don't have sort of a connection with or people recognizing and respecting what's going on in Lebanon the last few days, then you don't have a correct analysis of modern imperialism. You just don't. You have some sort of utopian vision or purity fetish, and you're cutting yourself up and putting yourself in a tiny, irrelevant box. You know how many people have criticized us for having our three people at the funeral of Nasrallah? It's insane to me. People that, plaster their social media and hammers and sickles, but clearly don't know what those hammers and sickles mean.
Well, if we look at the same thing would be applied if we go back 50 years. Like, these same kinds of people would not have been in favor of the country that had the hammer and sickle as its flag. They would have been on the other side, because you can only these people can only back something which doesn't exist, and something which can never exist. Where like you run into Maoist movements in Britain, such as they are. It's like, okay, well, where's the peasantry that you're a part of? If you're a strict Maoist. And I don't say that to mock people who admire the Mao Zedong thought, but like Western Maoism and Trotskyism and all these other things are promoted precisely because they are there to lead people precisely away from the direction of actually understanding imperialism and doing something about it. So like when the special military operation started, you got all these people saying, oh, we oppose Putin's gangster capitalism, which I'm not quite sure what that is. I think, it's actually a reference to like Yeltsin's period in the 1990s, where you actually had Russia almost turned into a neo-colony of the United States, Britain, and Germany. And then the whole reason why this started is precisely because Putin, on behalf of a national bourgeoisie, wanted to put certain limits on the way in which US, British, French, and German corporations could hyper-exploit the resources of Russia. And because imperialism will have no limit and can have no limit, they immediately threw a fit and declared him to be the second coming of Stalin, to which we reply, well, if only.
Right.
But this inability to understand imperialism as the primary contradiction leads them to misunderstand, like, well, what is the priority within Russia right now? And priority within Russia right now, as most Russian Marxists would agree with this, I think, is that the attempt to destroy the country via the Ukraine war has to be defeated. And then if there's issues, which there are, contradictions with the Russian capitalist class, well, then the Russian working class will deal with those once the threat to the country has been set back. You can't deal with an internal threat properly when the external threat is hanging over your head. You need to prioritize where you're sending like literally your forces. But again, like if you're not serious about building anything, then you can just sit around all day on the internet screaming down with Putin's gangster capitalism, and probably getting retweeted by US aid sponsors accounts.
Absolutely. And that's another thing that we might want to break into is how clueless do you have to be when you have 300 followers and suddenly all of your tweets about bashing Putin or whatever are blowing up, right? But it's interesting that first of all, yes, like Zhuganov, the KPRF, I mean, they were calling for intervention in Ukraine long before Putin did it, right? All through Marxist history, this has been it's sort of a settled question: the alliance of all the patriotic forces, right? I mean, the entire Chinese Revolution rests upon this. The Chinese flag stands for multiple classes, and they were the patriotic forces that overthrew the Japanese sort of invader and ended the warlord era, fought the Civil War, etc. But in the modern day, we seem to it keeps coming back to this aesthetic and glomming onto that, regardless of what the facts are. And that's something that really has been bothering me. We've been going on for an hour and a half already, by the way. And we had a few questions in the chat that I want to make sure we get to. So I want to pause before we go any further. So Doug here asks, how does the ACP plan to achieve power? He says he comes in peace, just curious. The right way. It's a long, tedious road of actually establishing political consciousness, class consciousness, and genuine sections of the country that are run by us. I mean, how did the Republicans do it when they took over from the Democrats? They went local election by local election. The thing with communists, though, is it's not just about elections, right? It's about roots in a community. It's about, Mao says that communists swim among the people as fish, right? And that's us. This is why the ACP, rather than funding ourselves with dues from our members and sort of taxing them, each chapter is creating businesses, right, that can be involved in that local community and supply a very necessary need in that community. It's a long road, but it's the only one that organically overcomes, as we walk down it, all of the falsifications and lies that have been spread about communists, about Marxism, etc., over the decades preceding the 2020s. That's a great question, though. Don Pierce is next. He says, I still want to know the difference between the left and a leftist, which makes no sense to me. But when he sees this question, he won't like it. I assume that's me. But do you want to take a stab at this one, Alex?
Well, I think the left. Let's use the Anglo-American example. The left, of course, it starts off being the left, quite literally, of the États Généraux in the French Revolutionary period, being those who were opposed to monarchy and church, etc., church power, etc. So the radical end of the French Revolution. That's where the term comes from. It unlike any word or description, it evolves through several different meanings over time. The description of the left in like mid-19th century Europe would have been basically those who were clustered around like ideals related to French republicanism, early utopian socialism, elements. All those elements would feed into it. The left post-Russian Revolution takes on a different meaning again. It generally means, though it meant for a long time, those who were clustered around working class organizations, with the mass working class organizations being the basis of them, either social democratic parties or like communist parties later on. And then it undergoes another evolution, because what happens is, if I use the example of the United States, and correct me if I'm getting your history wrong, there was a determined attempt by the U.S. ruling class to make sure that the CPUSA in its revolutionary period was severed from the working class and was severed from the trade unions in the United States before the end of the 1940s, which is where the hammer really came down on the CPUSA, including, I believe, the imprisonment of Gus Hall and others of its leaders. The aim of that wasn't just simply repression; it was to sever any chance of the CPUSA being able to influence the wider working class through the American Union movement. And there was, unfortunately,
that was when the CIO begins being built. That was really the danger.
Yes.
9 of the 11 CIO unions were red unions, and that is what terrified them. Sorry, go ahead.
And where was the SWP and the Max Shachtman organization at the time? Well, they were supporting the purge of the communists from the CIO. Of course they were.
And by the way, they were also supporting Nazis in Ukraine at the time, but that's a whole nother bag of it.
Same story today. But the point about like the left is, what you get in the United States is when the American state machine severs the Marxism-Leninism from the left, from like the working class, the left comes to mean something else. Because what happens is, rather than you having a CPUSA, which is a unifying Marxist-Leninist organization, you still get working class rebellions in the United States, be they from workers in various different industries, such as, I believe there was obviously the militancy in the American steel industry, car industry, mining industry. The problem, and of course you get the upsurge in revolutionary activity amongst the particularly oppressed black working class population in the United States. The problem is that without a unifying Marxist-Leninist organization, all of these rebellions shoot off in different directions, some waging particularly heroic struggles, others less so, all of which ultimately get crushed by the American state. Point is that what became the left in the United States, which is of course the leading imperialist power, essentially boils down to a series of pseudo-radical organizations, largely based in fading labor aristocracy, academia, and other elements that are non-working class, or at least like the upper end of the working class, which are all floating around where? The left of the bourgeoisie, which is what it's become. Marx makes the observation, no, actually, I believe it's Engels that makes the observation that in the period after 1850, which we saw the coup that brought Louis Napoleon to power in the creation of the new French Empire in the 1850 to 1870 or so, the working class was pushed out of French politics entirely, and the term left became just a reference to the French bourgeois left. Same is true in the United States and the imperialist powers. The term left became drained of working class content 50, 60, 70, almost 80 years ago. So what you have as the left in the United States, what is it? It's the left of bourgeois politics as personified in the foul personages of the Democratic Party and all of the things that orbit around it. So to go back to Don's question, what is a left? The left in the United States basically means the left of the bourgeoisie in reality. Certainly since the 1940s, really, and certainly since the crushing of like the Black Panthers and other radical organizations in the 1960s. So to bring this to a conclusion, a leftist now, or a leftist over the last 20, 30 years in the United States, well, what does that leftist end up doing? Ends up in various ways being a repository and a replicator of leftist bourgeois ideology, whether you know that's what you're doing or not, because this is what I did. When I was a Trotskyite, I was replicating British bourgeois leftist ideology. Now, again, like you might say, oh, I didn't want to do that. Well, it doesn't matter what you wanted to do. It's what you did. And that's what many of us ended up doing. And so that, I hope that answers Don's question in the sense that if you if you destroy class politics, which is what the American ruling class didn't quite do, but they damaged its organizations to the point where it didn't get a proper expression in a revolutionary party, you end up just with left of the bourgeoisie, meaning the left.
Yeah, I see Sebastian came to chime in, that which is awesome. But just give me 2 seconds and you can go, Sebastian. Don, always think about the context, right? Anytime someone's speaking, there's a universal use of words, but there's also a particular use that only applies to the context that they acquire as you're speaking, right? So you can talk about a left of bourgeois society in general, which would be any of the progressive forces, or you could be referring to something that calls itself the left, right? Which would be exactly what Alex is talking about. You could talk about, well, in the situation of the bourgeois class, because the left got divorced from the proletariat, we therefore only have the left of the bourgeois class, not a proletarian sort of aspect to it at all. The context is always what's key. This is why a lot of times I refer to them as the fake left, right? Or I'll say leftist in scare quotes, etc. Go ahead, Sebastian.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much everything I wanted to say was covered by you, but from my perspective, what leftism is today is nothing more than really an identitarian label. And I sort of wanted to ask you, like, do you have any insight on the concrete origins of this term? Like, has it come explicitly out of this sort of the misidentification, misrepresentation of Marxism, and people's reluctance to sort of label themselves as that, and rather just have a personal allegiance with some sort of whatever they perceive as progressive?
Yeah, I think that the usage of the term progressive, I think, is more used in the United States than it is here. But it's partially a reflection of the victories of anti-communism, and very few people were willing to identify themselves as actual communists for a very long time, and like for a lot of people, they wanted to identify with some broad, generic seeming progressive project, which ultimately wouldn't get you fired from your job, wouldn't get you victimized, and wouldn't get you a visit from the police or the Federal Bureau of Investigation. If you just say, well, I'm a leftist, I'm a progressive, I support this cause, that cause, the other, I don't take deliberately don't take a holistic view of the necessary actions that would be needed to actually attain any progressive change in an imperialist country. I'm just in favor of this cause, that cause, or the other cause. It's a way of essentially making your politics utterly meaningless, because what you're doing is essentially saying that, well, I don't take a systemic view. I don't view class as the primary contradiction internally. I don't view imperialism as the primary contradiction in the external world. And if you're doing all of those things, then it's a way of essentially, it's a way of virtue signaling. It's a way of banking, without wanting to go into the area of the fake stories about the Chinese system. It's a way of banking social credit, perhaps, for yourself, or social capital for yourself, that you can then use to boost your reputation later on. Being aesthetically left has been a very popular choice for, like, I'll give you an example. When I was a trade unionist years ago now, I sat down with like a very senior manager in the organization I worked for. And the first thing she said to me was, I'm a radical. Bear in mind, this is somebody who's on like 3, 4, 5 times what I was on, like very, very senior, like management level. I'm a radical. I don't like the monarchy. And I was like, well, how does that affect our negotiations over you laying people off? Exactly. It doesn't. Not in that sense, anyway. But that's what, like, you find a lot of these like highly salaried, high management people, certainly in Britain, you'll find a lot of them like to hide behind like leftist phraseology, hide behind like sort of progressive values, and ultimately they're the worst rapacious scumbags you can possibly find. The worst managers often are those who are like pretend to be the worker's friend, hide behind progressive language. And again, it comes back to this thing about there is a particular form of bourgeois leftism, if you want to take it all the way back, it's been there since the 1840s, and Karl Marx and Marx and Engels' criticisms of this in the Communist Manifesto. There's a form of bourgeois leftism, which again, always been there. And again, people attach themselves to it because they want to look as if they want to look like radical, they want to look like they're a good person, they want to immunize themselves from criticism. And
can I hop in here, Alex? It's interesting to me that this actually becomes really ideologically concrete after what we call the Civil Rights Revolution, right? Towards the New Left era, when the genuinely left-wing forces begin to get very compromised, right? They're all infiltrated. There's intelligence agents in all of them. I think the FBI bragged at one point that every left-wing organization in America had at least one agent in it, and the CPOSA was like over 40% FBI or something crazy. But who knows if they're telling the truth? But what it does is it sort of develops into this hyper individualism, right? Where what matters to them is how they see themselves. The ideas that they choose to characterize their individual identity with, which is, philosophically speaking, one, subjective idealism, right? You are what you think you are. And two, reactionary, right? We're already past this point. It's going backwards to an older philosophy that's already sort of been discussed and thrown out as not compatible with reality, right? You aren't what you say you are. You are instead an entire history that develops into you. There's, before you even have a thought, you've gone through your whole life giving character to what that thought is, how it comes about, what it's about, etc. Right? And so this whole, like, you can't tell me my lived experience, man, that quote unquote leftists do, is in materialist terms hyper reactionary, right? It's individualist and subjective idealist, all this stuff. I hope that answers your question, Don.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say one last thing in response to this. He said this a little bit ago, and leftists, they're effectively part of the left that we were discussing, that is the left wing of bourgeois politics. But that doesn't mean that the left concretely doesn't mean something to Marxists, which is entirely separate to that. So yeah, that sort of, does that answer your question? Or
I hope so. Yeah, that's why a lot of times I'll say fake left and say, like, guess what? There's a real left wing in America now. There wasn't for a long time. I mean, in the UK, at least you guys had, like small groups that are now getting larger. Right here, we had nobody for a minute, which frankly sucked. David, thank you for the $2, brother. David is one of the oldest patrons of Midwestern Marks, and he's fantastic. We love David. By the way, everybody, we are a 100% people-funded institute. Despite what you may have heard from crazy people on the internet, we don't get money from the Russian government, the Chinese government, or the American government. I've heard all three, which
or USAID.
But whatever. Everything in our budget comes from you. So thank you. Yeah. I don't know, man. I think that I think 2024 marks the beginning of a new era in politics, just in general, in world politics. And I think it's brought about essentially through financialization reaching its highest phase. If imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, then full financialization is the highest stage of imperialism, right? Where our money is no longer even tied to a commodity and labor anymore. It's instead based on debt, which is value that is yet to be created, right? So, and I mean, without getting into a whole big bag of bananas about that, this causes changes, reflections of change all through society, right? It causes what I call hyperalienation, leading to that individualism we were just talking about, right? The need to have some connection with what makes you human again, when you're so far removed from it, right? What do Marx and Engels teach us makes us human at our most essential level? It's our ability to do labor, right? That's what begins us growing thumbs, right? That's what begins us even communicating. Our humanity is tied to our labor. And not only are we forced to sell that now, but we're forced to sell that to people who already owe it to someone else, And the people really accumulating the capital these days, or capital, they're speculating. They're creating new debts and stealing the very value within our money, in our accounts, by creating new debts in the money supply, right? That's sort of inflation, but at the same time, what it's really doing is devaluing all the money we have. So they're hitting us from multiple angles. And these two things, and we're already like coming up against time soon, so we don't really have time to get into it. But these two things are in contradiction with each other and cannot hold. And you see this new necessity. This is why the middle class is dying away. This is why the process I call reproletarianization is coming about, right? And this is why we see real Marxism coming back with a vengeance. Not just, trickling in, but slamming into the scene, saying, we're here now. Everything else in the PMC middle class nonsense that came before us, fuck you. We're here now. It's time for change. We can't fuck around anymore. Sorry for swearing.
Well, I got to duck out in a minute, comrades, because getting late here, and I got to get up early in the morning. But I'll leave you with just a response to what you said there, Noah, which is that your analysis of reproletarianization, that actually goes a long way to explaining like the rise of Donald Trump, the actual rise of Trump, because what you have is a lot of people in the working class or the upper working class and the petty bourgeoisie of the United States trying desperately to look back to what they imagine the post-war era was. And again, like Trump in various ways, he contradicts himself all the time, but like keeps going back to this idea of we're gonna get back to that somehow. Make America Great Again is basically about, a lot of it taps into like imagery or like what people imagine like the Roosevelt era was. And then you have like the what goes on with like reproletarianization, to use your term, people getting squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, desperately looking for ways back to what they imagine a better past was. And then what do you have at that moment? You have the same process going on inside Britain, inside France, inside Italy. It's why inside Germany. It's why you get the rise of Alternative for Deutschland. It's why you get the sort of neo-fascist forces emerging in Italy and France. What is it? It's large elements of the petty bourgeoisie and elements of the upper working class desperately looking for a way back. There's no way back. That's the point. It's neither possible nor desirable, but these people are desperately looking for it. And the point is, the great bulk of the working class, who have been hammered for decades, haven't raised themselves to the point of organization yet where they can actually make their presence felt in a serious and organized way. So this is why you get this sort of desperate cycling through all these bourgeois chancers like Trump, like Nigel Farage, like all those other characters in Europe, whilst the upper end of the working class tries to cling on to what it's got. And they won't be able to, because, as you say, total financialization means reindustrialization under capitalism is just simply not possible. It's not possible under American capitalism right now. It's too degenerated. Britain, even worse. It's why, even with them screaming about war with Russia, they're talking about sending British military production, outsourcing it to India. Well, how's that supply chain going to work exactly? What, do you think the Russians are going to let you ship military equipment all the way from India, maybe through the Suez Canal, all the way up to Britain without sinking the fucking thing? It proves that they're not serious in the slightest about anything. They can't get away from financialization. No matter how much they scream and shout and jump up and down about reindustrialization, the system's too rotten for that, which Marx identified as a tendency inbuilt within capitalism as early as Capital Volume 2. But apparently, nobody told Donald Trump that, obviously, and nobody told apparently most of the social democrats that either. So the reason why Marxism Leninism is reviving, as you say, is because literally all the other elements of the left have been tried, they've all failed, and the American worker will turn to Marxism Leninism in increasing numbers because of the explanatory power of Marxism Leninism, if actually explained and taught adequately in a serious way.
100%, brother. I'll say one more thing and we'll wrap up. I want to be respectful of your time. We usually only go for 2 hours anyhow, so this is a good time to call it for the night. I think, though, that there's two things. I think we could even call it the return to bourgeois nationalism, right? If we say FDR was a bourgeois nationalist, which he was, Trump is a return of this same sort of thing. And a lot of them see the writing on the wall. I think Silicon Valley specifically allying to Trump is sort of trying to go after the infrastructure of what was holding it up in order to come out ahead as it collapses. And I don't think they're going to be able to do it. I think we're really at this turning point where we're down to socialism or barbarism time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this leads us to fulfilling rather than running away from reproletarianization. The middle class is gone for good. Like we've been saying all night, there's no time machine. We cannot go back to the past. What we can do is push forward and take people out of the limbo that the reproletariat is in right now, stuck in service jobs, right? And we can create a new technologically advanced industrial future, but only if the forces of the proletariat and reproletariat are in charge, meaning only through communism. Anyway, I want to thank you, Alex, for joining us tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor, comrade. Take us out with last words. It is all on you, brother.
Well, thank you, comrades, for the invitation. And I would say that if you're in the United States or Britain or any imperialist country right now, then the onus is on you to, if you're not already involved in an organization, to get organized, to start educating yourself and others, to learn from the classics of Marxism and apply it to the concrete situation in your country today, however you can. Be aware that in the initial period, we will be talking to, by necessity, a minority of the advanced workers. That's where we start. Through them and through the recreation of the organic intellectual layer of the working class, whether American or British or wherever, we will then be able to speak to the wider layer of the great masses of the workers in the US, in Britain, and the other imperialist countries, with the message that your enemy is not overseas, your enemy is not a Palestinian or a Lebanese person or a worker from Russia or China or wherever. It is sitting in Washington, D.C. It is sitting on Wall Street. It is sitting in the city of London or the Paris Bourse or the Berlin Stock Exchange or wherever you want the center of power is. And people will be forced to reach this conclusion due to the nature of the war on the working class. And they will be forced ultimately to learn, as Stalin pointed out many years ago in the Foundation to Leninism, that the true alliance must be forged between ourselves and the imperialist countries and the oppressed nations and peoples of the world to fight together against imperialism, which, if we're not careful, will not only try to destroy the oppressed nations of the world, but will destroy us on the way down with it. Because the ruling classes of Britain and the United States would rather burn these countries to ash than have the working class rule them. And we should never forget that. But it is not inevitable that they will win. We have the numbers, if organized and educated properly and trained properly and propelled in the right direction by a real vanguard party, then we can win. It's just a matter of leaving the aesthetic leftists behind and embracing the idea of real proletarian organization, which hasn't been seen in either of our countries for so many years.
Well said. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next Monday.
Thanks.
Stand up, all victims of oppression, for the tyrants fear your might. Don't cling so hard to your possessions, for you have nothing if you have no right. Let racist ignorance be ended, for respect makes the empires fall. Freedom is merely privilege extended, unless enjoyed by one and all. So come, brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in the song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. Let no one build walls to divide us, walls of hatred nor walls of stone. Come greet the dawn and stand beside us. We'll live together or we'll die alone. In our world poisoned by exploitation, those who have taken, now they must give. And end the vanity of nations. We've but one earth on which to live. So come, brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in the song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. And so begins the final drama, in the streets and in the fields. We stand unbowed before their armor, we defy their guns and shields. When we fight, provoked by their aggression, let us be inspired.